My name is Ricardo Saliscano and I was born in Nicaragua, a country full of contrasts where cultural wealth and natural beauty coexist with stories of darkness that often remain hidden. Today I come to tell you my story, a story that may seem implausible to you, but I assure you that it is completely real. Every word you will hear is a testimony of what I lived, the good, the bad and the unimaginable. From a very young age I witnessed and participated in forces that operate in the spiritual world, forces that many prefer to ignore or dismiss, but the reality is that these forces exist and have a tangible impact on our lives. The power of evil represented by Satan is real and manifests itself in ways that often go unnoticed. These influences subtly infiltrate through objects, seemingly harmless decisions and even thoughts that we believe are ours but are not. I lived that reality firsthand, immersing myself in dark practices that promised me power but in reality only tied me to an abyss of destruction. I know there are those who will listen to this with skepticism, thinking that they are exaggerations or stories to scare. I myself would have thought the same at some time in my life, but let me tell you something: the unknown does not cease to exist just because we ignore it. My story is a reminder that even if we do not see it, there is a constant struggle in the spiritual realm, a battle for our souls that is fought every day. In this battle I learned the hard way that there is no neutrality, no one is exempt from being influenced, and our choices, as small as they may seem, have much greater repercussions than we imagine. My life was shaped by those choices, first by those that led me to a dark path and then by those that took me out of it. Each decision brought me closer to one force or the other, and I was not always aware of it. Today I am here to share with you not only my fall but also my redemption. I want you to know that no matter how far you have gone on a wrong path, there is always hope. I know because I lived it. This story is not about glorifying the evil I experienced but about showing the power of the light that finally reached me, even in the darkest corners of my existence. So I invite you to listen with an open heart to what you are about to hear. It is not a common story, it is a testimony of transformation, struggle, and a God who does not give up on anyone, no matter how lost they may seem. From a very young age, I became immersed in the world of the occult almost without realizing it. It all began with a simple toy. At that time, I did not measure the implications of that Ouija board that today continues to be found in universities, schools and other spaces, even in the hands of some Christians who, without regarding its meaning, use it as a game. I saw it as something exciting and different, without understanding that each interaction left a mark that would not easily disappear. If someone still keeps one of these objects, my advice is clear: destroy it. It is not a game. It is a door that should never be opened. I also remember how at that time I played with other toys that I now understand carried a symbolic charge. Among them were the Smurf dolls that some considered harmless, but that according to stories from that time would have had terrible consequences. In Costa Rica there was talk of how these dolls caused the destruction of a family, even going so far as to set their house on fire. Those stories seemed exaggerated at the time, but the impact was such that in some places in the country the dolls were banned. However, in other parts of the world parents take their children to the cinema to watch the Smurf movies without noticing what they could be introducing into their lives through those characters. If any of your children have these toys, I recommend making them disappear. The innocent appearance can hide something much darker than it seems. Going back to the Ouija, at first I used it naively, even to try to get answers in school exams. The idea of being able to have control over something as simple as a correct answer seemed fascinating to me. It was then when I met 3 friends with whom I shared these experiences. We lived on the Atlantic coast, but our roots were diverse. One had an Israeli father and an English mother. Although we had all grown up in Nicaragua, the multicultural environment in which we lived made our curiosity for the unknown feel natural. However, while my friends seemed to see it as a simple adventure, I began to feel a deeper connection with those practices. In me, the attraction was not just curiosity but something that began to shape my life in a dangerous way. My parents eventually found faith, was converted, and they knew the Word of God, dying as believers. Their change was an example of transformation and redemption. but by then I was already deeply involved in occult practices. I could not understand or accept what they had found in my mind. My path was backward and I saw no reason to change. My attraction to witchcraft and sorcery grew over time. Along with other companions we immersed ourselves in a world that fascinated us. We studied black magic, white magic, Satanism and other disciplines related to the occult. Each practice seemed to promise something new or a power that made us feel superior and different. We used snails' shells, bones and objects associated with rituals. Palaros. We believed that these elements were tools to achieve absolute control over what surrounded us. As we advanced in our learning we always wanted more. Ambition to discover new levels of power became insatiable. On the Atlantic coast there was a specific deteriorated and gloomy place where we used to meet there, invoking people to move away from their churches. Seeing them move away from the faith made us feel powerful, as if we had won something significant when in reality we were only destroying them. In our forays into churches we quickly identified who were firm in their faith and who we perceived were spiritually vulnerable. Those who were solid in their relationship with God seemed to have a kind of barrier that prevented us from getting close, a force that exceeded what we believed we could handle. It was frustrating, but it also made us more determined to destabilize those we perceived as weak. However, our commitment to these practices took us to increasingly dark levels. Every 4th of the month we performed rituals that included animal sacrifices. We went to cemeteries where after the sacrifices we consumed what was offered while invoking pastors and leaders wishing to destabilize them. We rejoiced in sowing chaos and somehow we felt that we were achieving our purpose. What we did not understand was that each step sank us deeper into an abyss from which it would be almost impossible to get out. On many occasions I witnessed how people approached the faith without true intention of compromising. For many the church was a spectacle, a place to go to see who was preaching or what was happening, as if it were a social event rather than a spiritual space. I remember how they watched with passing interest without understanding that faith is not about placing a Bible verse like Psalm 91 on a wall, thinking that that would be enough to protect them. It was an empty gesture lacking depth. What really transforms are not the symbols but the devotion, fasting, intense prayer and genuine intercession for those around you, from pastors to neighbors and relatives. However, at that time I did not understand or value these things. My path was completely opposite. In the group to which I belonged we were looking for young people to join our dark practices. We needed 13 members to complete the circle that we considered essential for our activities. They called us the Ashes, a name that reflected our complete dedication to darkness and destruction. Recruiting new members was not a simple process. The aspirants had to go through a ritual that terrified even the most brave. You lit a line of fire that extended from one end to the other and the aspirant, stripped of all clothing, had to walk through it after being anointed with blood and oil. If they managed to cross without burning they were accepted and sealed a pact with us. Those who did not succeed were consumed by the flames or abandoned, leaving them as symbols of failure. The rituals were not limited to this initiation. During the nights of the full moon, we went to cemeteries where we consumed parts of human bodies. We believed that by ingesting these remains we acquired more power that strengthened us spiritually and physically. Our goal was always to surpass anyone, even those who professed an unbreakable faith. We wanted to be stronger than them, stronger than their church, stronger than their God. For us the faith of others was not something sacred but an obstacle that had to be destroyed. As we advanced in these practices our ambitions overflowed. It was no longer enough for us. We wanted to demonstrate our power in more extraordinary ways. We even tried to levitate ourselves in the air as a sign of our supposed superiority during our rituals. We used tricks and manipulations of the environment to make it seem like we were achieving it, even though we knew deep down that it was a deception. We convinced ourselves that we were achieving something transcendental. That illusion made us feel invincible. I remember one occasion when a pastor approached me with some fear, saying that he did not want problems with me. My response was forceful. From the moment you accepted Christ, you already have problems with me, and with everything that I represent for us. Anyone who declared themselves faithful to God was automatically our enemy. There were no middle grounds. We made fun of the pastors who said they were facing evil. convinced that they were nothing more than empty words. We used to say with sarcasm, "I wish he would really appear to see if he is as brave as he says." I say that for us, our territory to perform rituals and incantation, those dark spaces loaded with symbolism became the settings for our most disturbing practices. There we spoke in strange languages which we called satanic languages, with a single objective: to invoke dark forces that interfere in the life of those who sought to connect with God. The purpose was simple but effective: to send distractions that diverted people from their intention to attend church. We knew exactly how this worked. Someone could be determined to go to Sunday service, but with our invocations we would get an unexpected visitor to knock on his door, an old acquaintance, a friend he had not seen in years, someone who with small talk managed to entertain him long enough for him to abandon his plans once the door opened. Spiritual commitment was left in the background and the church was not his priorities. These tactics, although subtle, were more powerful than many imagined. On one occasion, I heard a story that still resonates in my mind. A pastor walking down a dark path came across a man in a black hat. He greeted him politely, even mentioning God. The pastor responded with the same naturalness, but something in the air was disturbing. When he asked the man who he was, the answer was direct: "I am Satan, your enemy." Even though the pastor tried to remain calm, it was clear that this was not a coincidence. It was a warning, palpable proof of the existence of those forces that many prefer to ignore or treat as myths. These experiences underlined a reality that few wanted to accept. These forces could manifest themselves anywhere, even in homes, like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. They could infiltrate in the most unexpected ways. Meanwhile we continued with our activities, concentrating on diverting people's attention to the mundane. We knew that if they managed to prioritize their material concerns over the spiritual, they would be further from achieving a true connection with their faith. We recorded dark prayers designed to sow distractions and chaos. We rejoiced to see how some Christians, instead of dedicating themselves to fasting or prayer, focused their energy on filling their tables with food or resolving temporal matters. For us it was a victory to see how they neglected their spirit and prioritized the immediate over the eternal. In our meetings everything revolved around demons, governors and powers. There was no place to mention God. His name had no place in our conversations. Our organization was rigorous. We established precise hierarchies. Each member knew his place and his function. Ironically, this structure made us feel more united and disciplined than many religious communities we observed. While they seemed disorganized or too distracted with their own routines, we took advantage of that weakness to advance our influence. That organization became our most powerful weapon. We recognized that if we wanted to maintain control and expand our influence, we had to work together with a common purpose. Even in the midst of darkness, our focus and unity were key to achieving our goals. It was an ironic and disturbing contrast. While churches and families lived in disarray, we advanced from the shadows with precision, confident that we could dominate the spaces that others neglected. Over time our group delved into practices that made us feel powerful, as if we were above the rest. One of those practices was levitation, a trick we used to demonstrate our supposed superiority. We saw it as an act that separated us from others, a symbol of our extraordinary abilities. We decided to test our power in an unusual setting, a church, a small place frequented mainly by old men and women whose devotion, according to us, seemed to have waned. Convinced that they were already lost to the kingdom of God, we entered with total confidence, sure that we could destabilize that place. While we were observing, something unusual happened. The faithful were reprimanding someone who had arrived with a disturbing attitude. This caught our attention and we decided to act. We believed that it was the perfect moment to show our skills and cause chaos. With determination, we began to rise in the air, floating before their eyes. We used the methods and tricks that we had learned. The reactions were immediate. Some screamed in terror, others ran away in terror. Even the pastor, whom we considered the spiritual leader, fled through the back door, leaving his congregation in complete bewilderment. However, not everyone gave in to fear. An old woman remained in her place, kneeling with a firmness that we had never faced. From her position she said calmly, even if 1 in 10,000 come against me I will not fear. Then she pointed and said with authority, as they went up they will come down in the name of Jesus. In that instant something inexplicable occurred. A force that we could not understand knocked us to the ground. We tried to understand what had happened, but the only thing we saw was a multitude of bright hands surrounding the woman, among them a shining figure more intense than any other. There was an authority that emanated from him that we had never faced. It was a disconcerting moment that left a mark on me, although at that time I did not fully understand it. Shortly after my life took a different turn, I joined the army and was involved in an armed conflict between Honduras and Nicaragua. During a confrontation, a tragic mistake occurred. 2 buses full of civilians were mistaken for enemy soldiers. More than 180 innocent people lost their lives. That devastating event almost unleashed a full-scale war and left me with a feeling of emptiness and disorientation. It seemed that everything I had pursued up to that moment was meaningless. In the midst of that darkness, I began to perceive something different. An invisible force seemed to protect me in the most critical moments. I did not understand what it was, but later I would discover that it was my mother's prayer. While I sank into the darkness, she remained on her knees interceding for me with a faith so strong that it seemed to cross any barrier. Her constancy, without me knowing it, began to plant something in my spirit, a seed that would eventually bear fruit. Although at that time I could not discern that divine connection, it began to influence me life little by little. Little by little an unknown peace began to make its way through me. A peace that I had not found in my occult practices or in the violence of the armed conflict. Later I understood that this peace could only come from God. His presence not only transforms the individual but also everything that surrounds him, from marriage to the family, bringing harmony and hope. This peace was the beginning of a change that I was not yet ready to accept, but that was already beginning to touch my life in ways that I could not ignore. On one occasion we ventured to cross into a territory that we had planned to attack. From a distance we saw a camp that seemed the perfect target. We felt confident, sure that it would be an easy victory. However, while we were preparing to advance, something unexpected happened. We saw enemy tanks approaching rapidly. The sound of their engines broke our concentration and panic took hold of us. We were not ready to face such a threat. The only option we had left was to flee. We crossed desperately to the other side of Nicaragua, hoping to find refuge, but instead of safety, what awaited us was an ambush. Suddenly the bullets began to fly from all directions. It was absolute chaos. Shots came from one side to the other while we were just trying to survive. The air was filled with screams and the deafening sound of combat. We finally managed to cross, but not without devastating consequences. We lost many comrades in the crossfire. Enemies and civilians also fell caught in the middle of the conflict. It was a disaster, a scene that remained engraved in my memory as a reminder of the fragility of life and the futility of what I pursued. That experience marked a breaking point for me. I decided to abandon everything and go to Costa Rica looking for some kind of refuge, or at least a place to hide from the devastation I had left behind. It was there that I met a young woman. Our circumstances brought us together, but in reality neither of us knew who the other really was. We both carried evil secrets and a dark past. As we used to say back then, between devils there are only more devils. It was a relationship destined to fail from the start. Despite our differences, she invited me to attend a religious campaign. "Let's go there," she told me with a naturalness that made me furious. My reaction was immediate and visceral. The idea of setting foot in a place of faith was unbearable for me. "I hate those damn people," I answered her coldly, making it clear that there was no place in my life for the church or for what it represented. Every word that came out of my mouth was directed to destroy everything they symbolized. My hatred was a mix of fury, fear and rejection towards something I could not understand. She did not give up and continued to insist. Her persistence only fueled my rage. I cursed her, also swearing that if she attended that campaign I would consider her my enemy. "You don't know who are you messing with?" I warned her, but deep down I didn't know who I was dealing with either. There was something in her insistence, something in her conviction that was beginning to challenge the darkness inside me. Even though I didn't want to admit it, her faith had a force that deeply disturbed me. Our argument reached a critical point when we drew a literal line between us. It was a symbolic border, a barrier that was everything that separated us. Neither of us seemed willing to cross it. However, to my surprise, she broke it with a confidence that I couldn't understand. That gesture filled me with a mixture of defiance and fear. I felt that something bigger was happening, something that I couldn't control. At that moment, I wasn't ready to give in. But what I didn't know was that that line would be the beginning of a change that would transform my life. Even though I resisted accepting it, something inside me was beginning to falter, and that fracture would mark the beginning of a new stage that I couldn't foresee. That limit that I drew between us, that line that marked the point of no return, was not just symbolic, it meant a real warning. If I crossed that barrier there would be no turning back. If you go through, I will cut you as I cut that line, I said, implying that I was referring to taking her life. It was not just a threat, it was an oath full of fury born of the pride and darkness in which I was submerged. In my mind that barrier was not negotiable, and any challenge to it was a direct offense to my authority. At the time I lived under codes that only those of us who were immersed in the world of the occult understood. Each gesture, each symbol had a purpose and a meaning. We had ritual signs and specific signals that reinforced our connection with the forces that we believed to control the world. Sometimes I saw those same gestures inadvertently sneak into religious spaces, preachers and pastors without realizing, copy emblematic of darkness. For me that was a cause for mockery and gave me a feeling of superiority. I thought, if they are not even aware of what they do, how can they protect their congregations? We had acquired what we considered powers. One of the most extreme and dangerous rituals we performed consisted of transforming ourselves into wolves, not like the ones that appear in the movies, but into creatures that represented the wild and the dark. To achieve this we followed a meticulous process full of symbolism. We put a log on the ground and began to turn around it, pronouncing specific curses and concentrating deeply. We crossed the log 3 times, each step intensifying our connection with the darkness. At the end of the ritual we felt that we had achieved our transformation. We perceived ourselves as ferocious beasts loaded with wild energy and ready for any confrontation. One day after that woman with whom I shared my life threatened me, something strange began to happen to me. I felt an oppressive weight on my chest, as if something invisible crushed me from within. An indescribable sensation like a ball of dark energy rose through my stomach, making it difficult for me to breathe. I got up soaked in sweat, remembering the words she had told me. Her threat was not empty. I felt it in every fiber of my being. Something inside me began to waver restlessly, that I could not ignore. Determined to face it, I gathered my remaining companions. We had all performed the transformation ritual. We were now wolves, ready to. We went out in search of her with the fury against those who believe that nothing can stop them. We found her on a cliff surrounded by other women, ready to fight to last consequences. What followed was a fierce battle, a mixture of grunts, screams and quick movements. Every moment was impregnated with pure violence. A confrontation that made it clear that only a few would come out alive from there. My 2 companions fell into the ravine during the fight, dragged by the chaos of the fight, that made clear the fragility of our supposed superiority. In the end, she and I were face to face. The confrontation was brutal. Although we had once shared a roof, I knew that I could not trust her and she could not trust me. I had always been taught to distrust even the person who slept next to me. At that moment, those words took on a literal meaning, but later I would understand that they spoke of something deeper, the treacherous nature of humanity. The confrontation with that woman was the culmination of an inevitable conflict, one that had been brewing for a long time. Face to face, I transformed into a black wolf and she transformed into a white wolf. We knew there was no going back. She had sworn that would kill me and I was determined not to allow it. I believed I had more power, a superior force that would assure my victory. The battle was fierce, full of growls, quick movements and unbridled violence. At the climax, with a precise blow, her head flew in one direction while his body fell to the nearby cliff. Blood splattered the rocks, marking the end of the fight. I was also injured with deep marks both physically and spiritually, but I managed to survive that confrontation. Left a phrase resonating in my mind: a divided kingdom cannot prevail. I had heard those words many times before, but at that moment they took on a new meaning. Despite the powers we thought we had, our internal divisions weakened us. Not only were we vulnerable to our enemies, but our own darkness devoured us from within, destroying everything we tried to build. After the fight I sought refuge. I came to a river and without thinking about it I submerged myself in its waters. It was not just an attempt to wash away the blood and sweat. There was something else, something deeper that I still could not understand. I felt a need for purification that I did not know how to express. I recovered and exhausted and returned home shortly. After I received news from my mother, who was in New York, she asked me, almost begged me, to join her and leave behind that life that was consuming me. In 1985 I finally became a resident of the United States. It was the first time I was in a completely different environment, a place that began to challenge my beliefs and my way of living. When I arrived I visited a Baptist church, although not with the intention of changing. My curiosity also led me to explore other religions such as Jehovah's Witnesses. However, nothing resonated with me. I was still trapped between my dark past and a possible redemption that always seemed out of my reach. By then my body began to show the ravages of my past life. That woman with whom I had fought not only left visible marks on my skin but also a dark legacy in my spirit. Before our confrontation she had performed a ritual against me, mixing his hair on the graveyard with dirt, animal bones and other elements that I preferred not to investigate. Since then my health began to deteriorate. I quickly began to cough, constantly weakening those who assured me that I should dress completely in white, even my underwear, as a symbol of purity that would heal me. But it was all a farce, a lie wrapped in a veil of empty rituals. I knew there was no holiness in those practices, only deception. The phrase "without holiness no one will see the Lord" resonated in my mind. Although I dressed in white, I knew that inside I was full of darkness, error and sin. I mocked those rituals, but I continued attending, caught in the hope of finding some relief. I learned various techniques, the secrets of the gurus, the rituals of voodoo, the Brazilian macumba and other magic systems. Each one promised to be more powerful than the last, but none offered me the real solution. It was at that point of desperation when something began to change in me. Although I was still immersed in the shadows, I began to understand that true strength was not in those practices. The power that surpassed everything I had known was one that I had heard mentioned in my few encounters with the faith of Jesus Christ. Although I still did not fully accept it, a seed had been planted inside me, and slowly, without realizing it, it began to germinate. Darkness continued to envelop me, but an unknown light began to make its way, pointing out a path that I had never imagined taking. My desperation to find relief led me to look for solutions in places unsuspected. No matter how rational or extreme they seemed, I was willing to try anything that promised a respite. For my weakened body and my tormented soul I tried ritual cleansings and consulted santeros and healers, spending large amounts of money that only ended up in the hands of quacks, but nothing worked. My health continued to deteriorate and my anxiety grew with each passing day. It was then that in a moment of need I entered a pharmacy. While I was browsing the shelves looking for something that could alleviate my symptoms, my eyes stopped on a yellow syrup with a label of 666 that left me perplexed. For many that number would have been a clear reason to walk away, but for me in my confusion and state I interpreted it as a sign. It was as if the enemy with whom I had been allied for so long was offering me a way out. Without thinking twice I bought it, convinced that this syrup could be the solution to my problems. At first, after taking it, I felt a slight improvement. It was enough so that my mind, desperate to find relief, clung to the idea that the syrup worked, but soon my body began to react adversely. The vomiting, diarrhea and an unbearable weakness intensified. Each dose left me worse than before, draining me not only physically but also mentally. It was then that I understood the nature of that remedy. It was nothing more than another trap, an illusion of relief designed to sink me even further into darkness. I felt that even the forces I had trusted were abandoning me, leaving me alone in my agony. In the midst of that desperation I ended up entering almost by accident into a church in Miami, Florida. It was a place called the Cathedral of the town. I did not go in of faith or spiritual curiosity. I went with a mixture of skepticism and contempt. I wanted to understand what people found in those places that made them sing, pray and feel so sure of something that I could not accept. I sat in the back trying to go unnoticed but with a firm purpose of observing and if possible sabotage what was happening there. While the faithful sang and prayed, I cursed in my mind, trying to break their concentration. The rage I felt towards them was almost inexplicable, a mixture of mockery and anger that consumed me. Suddenly something happened that caught my attention. A tall woman with overflowing strength and energy pounced on the evangelist who was leading the service and tried to strangle him. He was much shorter than her, but he did not give up. In the middle of the fight, the evangelist, with a calm and authority that I had never witnessed, rebuked the woman in the name of Jesus. She fell to the ground vomiting a yellow liquid that gave off an unbearable stench. That scene disconcerted me. I could not explain what I was seeing, but I could not deny it. There was something there, a power that went beyond everything I had known. Although my mind continued to resist, something inside me began to falter. As the service continued, I tried to find ways to interrupt it. I noticed a guitar that they used to accompany the chants. It broke incredibly. One of the strings broke at that very moment, but my satisfaction was ephemeral, because immediately the musicians took out another guitar and continued as if nothing had happened. That preparation, that resilience contrasted deeply with my inner chaos, and I could not help feeling frustrated. As the chants progressed, something began to worry me even more. It was as if an invisible force not only protected those present but also began to touch my own life. Later I learned that there were people praying for me even without knowing me, young and old, interceding in their homes or in similar meetings, and those prayers seemed to cross the barriers that I had built throughout my life. That day did not mark the end of my internal struggle, but it was the beginning of something different. Although I could not explain it, I felt that a door was opening. The prayers, the strength that emanated from them, began to make me feel inside. For the first time in a long time, I felt that something bigger than the darkness that surrounded me was beginning to be in my life. Even though I did not want to admit it, I had learned to ignore the closest needs while I pursued a dark and ambitious purpose. I was so focused on my big plans that I did not realize that the essential, the truly important thing was in my own home with my family, but at that moment I did not have the ability to see it. My rebellion was my shield and kept me away from anything that could bring me closer to the light. I was clinging to a path that, although it destroyed me, I continued to walk with stubborn determination. One day I attended a campaign that was taking place on Northwest 17th Avenue and 28th Street in Miami. An evangelist named Luis Esteban Guzman was preaching there. My intention was not to listen, much less to change. I had gone with a single objective: to destroy. My position strategically in a corner, watching every movement, weighty,